Well, I'll get started. Welcome everybody, and we're to Montessori Lives, conversations with notable Montessorians. And this evening we are very honored to have with us Dimitri. Dimitri, Dimitri is co-founder and custodian at Central Coast Montessori. So maybe I'll start by asking you to explain your title.
Um, Hi everyone. Look, it's interesting. A lot of this will tie in, and I think it's something that's come from having experienced Montessori over the years, where you particularly probably starting to do when I did the adolescent, not the adolescent, when I did the primary training, and we started to look at the etymology of words and started to pull them apart and dive a little bit deeper into language. And I became more aware of how Montessori started to use specific language that didn't just carry generic connotations. So it made you think about things. And what I started to realize was that, as I mentioned to you earlier, and this is probably kind of jumping, but I'll come back again, one of my fundamental kind of beliefs is that Montessori is playing is playing in the wrong game. And so what happens with that is, and this comes with the conversation around the term principal and the term school, and I just feel like what happens when you start to surround yourself with language like that, without even realizing it, you start to create a picture and a story around what should happen there. And I think we get locked into, that. And so, frameworks are beautiful. Frameworks help us build foundations to build other things, but we don't get stuck in that framework. And so Montessori, if nothing else, has taught me to imagine, to see what's possible. And I just wonder sometimes whether it starts from the simplest thing, like what do we call ourselves? We don't, we use the term guide, and I think that's very relevant. We use the term facilitator. I think that's relevant. I don't know whether principal is the term I like. I believe that not just myself, I believe the parents and the guides and the children are all custodians of the learning space we create. And so I think for me, creating that distinction was really important. The same way that, creating the distinction around the difference between schooling and a place where education just happens, the educative process unfolds. So I believe at the moment, custodian is something that sits comfortably, but I'm open to that being evolved, for that to evolve as well over time. So there's no attachment to that.
Yeah. So you prefer not to use the word school. Is there another term that you use to describe
Yeah.
Central Coast Montessori?
There's a few terms that I'm playing with. Yeah, so we do. We refer to ourselves as Central Coast Montessori. We do use the word school because in some cases, like when you're speaking to NESA or to a SEQA or to whatever, it's a term that people are familiar with and organizations are familiar with. So, and it's a tricky one because it does bring up things for certain people that perhaps are, are perhaps caught on the nuance of language. It's like, well, if you're not a school, what are you? Are you not learning? Are children not learning anything? It's like, well, no, we still meet NESA requirements. We still meet a SEQA requirements. That's not the point. The point is having the freedom to play with language and to be able to, as I said, draw that distinction. And there's a fellow by the name of Peter Gray who writes quite a bit about, I don't know if anyone's heard of him. He writes about learning and particularly learning subsistence skills in hunter-gatherer and forager societies. And he, in one of his essays, wrote or drew the distinction between schooling and the educative process, which he believed was innate in human beings and happens all the time, as opposed to schooling, which is something that is imposed upon children. And so for me, that, when you read something and it strikes a chord and it resonates with you. So I feel like in life, I kind of feel like a little bit of a collector of pieces of different things. And I say that, I'm going to jump from here and there. I hope you don't mind. But where that comes from is this. I was reading something about the Druids, the ancient Celtic wisdom many, many years ago. And they talked about the three fundamental yearnings of human beings. One of them was to be in your Arwen state, your creative state, whenever you needed to be. The other one was to be in deep commune with nature, of which we're a part. But the third one was to have access to the profound collective wisdom that exists. Now, to me, a school doesn't do that, doesn't allow you to have access to all the collective wisdom. And so for me, if we are going to build a framework that is going to hold us and be a container, then I think it's got to be self-aware enough to understand that there are moments where it's obsolete. There are moments that the language needs to be looked at, needs to be refined, not just for the sake of posterity, not just because we want to do it, to be clever or egotistical, but because I think it's at the crux of what Montessori was about. We should look at everything, we should pull it apart, and we should learn from that. And so that is what led me to feeling like there's nothing that should be off the table. There should be nothing that shouldn't be asked. And so, so to go full circle back, what I'm playing with this is that this idea that what we participate in and contribute to every day is, for me, a learning exchange. That's what effectively it feels like, more than a school, a place that exchange happens all the time. And I think what it does then is it removes this notion of it being top to bottom, hierarchical. It's that everybody has capacity there to engage and to offer, to participate, and moreover to contribute, which is then runs very parallel to Montessori's idea of valorization. To experience that for children every day, for me, is a significant thing. So I hope that answered.
Yeah, you've used the phrase "a diverse community of people committed to holding space for self-creation and social sculpture," which I love that constructivist kind of language and seeing school in a different light. How can you explain more what you mean by social sculpture?
Well, I suppose I can give you an analogy that I often give to parents, and it'll be a stepping stone to perhaps exploring that a little bit more. I often say to families, because I don't know if many of you experience this, but I believe probably this is why the story about Montessori not wanting it named after her has perhaps some relevance here, because a lot of people see the name Montessori, and again, it brings this idea that I'll go there because what I've heard and what I've read, it means everybody there is like-minded. We're all on the same page. And I couldn't, for me, from my experience thus far of almost 25 years, it couldn't be further from the truth. So what I say to people is, it's like this big library. I don't know if you've ever been into the State Library in Sydney, wall to wall, floor to ceiling books. And it's diverse, and there are volumes from all sorts of different places and people and times. And so for me, a learning community is like the library. We are all in there. We're all at different stages in our lives. We might have similar values, we might have similar principles, but based on this moment in time, I could be reading history about the Egyptians, and you could be reading I don't know, how to build houses. Someone else could be looking at architecture while someone else is looking at sustainable gardening. This is the beauty of a learning community, is that it is diverse and it's dynamic. But for me, the most important part, and the question is are you in here of your own volition? Are you cognizant of the choice you make? And do you take responsibility for that choice? Because we are not in the same section of the library. We're not, let alone in the same book, on the same page, on the same line. But we're all in the library, and that for me is what's the most beautiful part. And based on our organic unfolding, our own development, this notion of Montessori's of self-construction and self-creation, that's what we're doing every day. We are creating, constructing ourselves. That doesn't only happen through childhood, it happens through the entirety of our lives. And this is where the topic that you bring up and the conference that you've had about transformation is at the crux of that. We are constantly transforming all the time. And so a community is like that too. And this is where, often we'll talk about in Montessori that it's not a curriculum, not a scope and sequence, not this thing to be delivered or imparted in one uniform way. And so the library for me just represents this buzz of things going on and people building their lives through taking the profound collective wisdom around them to grow themselves. And so for me, it is what we do. If we are we are interconnected, but if we are growing independently and we're adapting to life and change as it takes place, then not only are we sculpting ourselves, we're not only creating ourselves, we are constructing society at the same time. And so that's kind of where I'm going with that kind of analogy, is that this is what we're doing day in and day out, moment to moment. And life provides us with this beautiful opportunity to do that.
I'm interested in the idea that school is perhaps an obsolete institution. There's an educational philosopher named Gert Biester from the Netherlands who is quite popular in the academic education literature and community, and he talks about how he says he likes being provocative, and he says that school and learning actually don't have much to do with each other. And when I first read that, it was quite shocking. And what he means is that, if school and learning happen together, it's sort of accidental, and that schools are about a very particular kind of learning that's very prescribed. And that doesn't really match the way that Montessori saw learning as something that happens all the time and everywhere, and not just in school. How does this idea of the learning exchange influence how Central Coast Montessori is set up? In what ways might people see it as different to another Montessori school?
Um, I think look, I suppose I can't sit here and say that I'm living the epitome of a learning exchange all the time. We are still functioning with the echoes of what a school is. We're still there, and it's interesting because I'm actually we together, when we have quite a lengthy enrollment process, and we do it intentionally, and there are many steps involved in that. And one of the big things that we're starting to be very open about is, because I don't know if many of you find this, but I found that when people come, exploring why they're coming is a really important piece. And I often ask them, straight off the cuff, talk to me about why. Why are you here? And if you can talk to me about that, talk to me about it without mentioning your children for a moment. Why did you get out of bed, often on a Saturday, because some of our sessions are on a Saturday, or they run for 4 hours of an evening? No one made you come here. So what made you, what inside you drew you to come here? And it's really important to start, for me, to tease that out, because people come up with these really beautiful, genuinely beautiful responses to that. The key for me is, how do you then allow them to remain cognizant of that thing that they expressed? Because Montessori, for me, is not black words on white paper. It's not the books that she's written. It's how do we as a community, as a learning community, bring those things to life? How do we interpret it? How do we live it? And so, what we're saying to them in these early sessions is, hold on to that thought, because I, as whatever you want to call me, the principal or the custodian or the guides, when they come together, the children, or Montessori as a pedagogy, does not create the learning community. We collectively create the learning community, and how we choose to practice it determines the kind of learning community we are. And so I think, for me, to be really honest, where we are a learning exchange at the moment is still in the intention. Our intention is to want to go there. Are we still bound by the rules of a game that I don't believe is inherently us? Absolutely. Am I frustrated by the fact that we've got this beautiful pedagogy that's over 100 years old, that is still not unapologetically, we're not unapologetically us. We're still trying to fit into, as I said, to play this game, to work within these rules that, for me, actually, and whether it be Montessori or Steiner or Reggio Emilia, I believe it's the same. I believe these rules do not allow us to actually realize what's possible, based on the core principles of our pedagogy, which is to offer each individual the opportunity to realize that they have a valuable contribution to make. So we are there in intent. We are there in slowly introducing this capacity to reflect on language and on ideas, and to try and pull apart and I suppose this will come up perhaps in this conversation, is conventional or public, whatever we want to refer to it as, public education, other educational approaches. And for me, what it is that we do, and I say to families when they come and they want to enroll, you're in a position at the moment where if you are looking at other avenues of education, I've got to say to you, it would be, and this is just my take, I don't know what everyone else feels about this. For me, it feels wrong to tell someone that Montessori is right or wrong, good or bad, better or worse. That's not my job. But what it is my job, and it would be remiss of me not to do, is to say to them, look, if you are still thinking about choosing X, Y, and Z, go visit them, have a look, ask questions. But if you choose this still thinking that those are on the table, you're not ready to make this choice because they're apples and oranges. They're different things. That does said, it doesn't make them better or worse, right or wrong. It just makes them different. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that it's different. And that's fundamental. It's fundamental because if we're not cognizant of it, we go into it with these ideas of what it should be. And if you go to the human tendencies, the tendency to orientate, to imagine, those ones in particular, you find because Montessori, for me, occurs in real time, it's a dynamic, living thing, you can't then rely on those old mechanisms that we've experienced to tell you whether it's succeeding or failing. Because they don't have any, they don't work here, and so, I mean, this alone could go up, we could go up in infinite directions, even with this. Where would you like to go?
So you're looking for a very deep philosophical commitment from people in your community who come.
Well, both the willingness to want I think this is the key for me is to accept the role that education has played in the past, because it's not been for nothing. We've learned a lot, and it's been used as a response to the time. So we need to accept the past. We need to embrace the future, but more than anything, we need to live in the now. What is now telling us about what education needs? And so, I think for me, it's the willingness to come into the library and not blame me or blame Montessori or blame your guide. Be willing to take responsibility for the choice you're making because of what you understand it offers. And that goes back to the apples and oranges. If they don't understand the choice they're making, then ultimately I say to them, the little voice will at some point creep up on your shoulder, and it will usually be as you're approaching high school, and it'll make you think, am I making the wrong decision for my child? Am I going to ruin them? And I'm upfront. We are upfront with families when we tell them that is going to happen. So if you step into Montessori and you're not willing to face your fears, then and if your fears aren't presented to you on a platter, then we're probably not doing our job. And so, for me, those things are really important as part of the conversation before we even enroll anyone.
Well, good on you for taking that stance. I think it's really important for building a committed community. But let's go back and look at your story a bit. How did you get into what's your Montessori story? How did you discover Montessori, and how did you get into the position that you are now?
So many, many years ago, my cousins who were they're now 28 and 30, around that 30, 32. They went to Montessori in Balmain. So they were at Balmain Montessori when they were very young, from 2.5, 3. And my background is Greek, we're Greek Egyptian. And for my uncle and auntie to send my cousins to Montessori at that time, it was kind of, they were quite radical, making this choice. But I was very close with my uncle and auntie growing up, really close, because they had children later. And my siblings and I were almost like children. They were like, extra sets of parents for us when we were young. And so we spent a lot of time with them. And I had gone away traveling, and I'd come back, and they always spoke very highly of the experience, and they loved their experience. And my uncle one day, and we were involved in coaching football, soccer coaching, my cousins' teams and things like that. He said, you have to come and have a look at the school, and meet the principal and things like that. And so I went along and I had a look and met the principal at the time, and I wasn't looking for work, but she had said to me, look, we don't have work at the moment, but I've got 3 young children, and they haven't all started at Montessori yet. So I need someone to help look after them whilst you're in between things. Are you interested? And I thought, okay, I'd always worked around children, again, coaching football and things like that. So it was not a hard thing to do. And I was in the process of not being certain. And so I started looking after the children, and it didn't take me very long. And I suppose that the crux of your question, or to directly answer your question, the biggest thing for me that stood out was I watched her with her children. And the thing that occurred to me was this person knows something that I want to know. Just the way, getting down to their level, and the way that she spoke to them, the attitude, the mindset, the approach. It was like, whatever she knows, I want to know, because it resonated so deeply, but it wasn't part of what I had learned growing up through both schooling and through the parenting that I'd seen in the broader community. So I started doing that work, and it wasn't it was probably about 12 months in when they were looking, as many Montessori schools were, to training. It's always the question of training. And so my name was put forward to be sponsored to go. At the time, there was no training in Australia. So I was fortunate to go and study in Dublin. At the time, Mary Hayes was the director of training in Dublin. I got to do the 2 years there, and then I got to do the third year with Grazzini and Biber, with Camilla and Biber in Bergamo, which was another amazing experience. But I can't tell you, like, when people ask not only what the story is, but what it's offered me in my life. When we talk again about this human tendency to orientate, I've got to say, in some way, it provided a lens or a compass or a framework through which I could look at life. And it was a beautiful way to look at life, because it didn't feel dictatorial. It didn't feel stifling. It didn't feel imprisoning, like a prison. It just felt like I could kind of stand up or climb up on the rocks and then see the vista from a very, very different perspective. It was, it was significantly life-changing. So I had the opportunity then, having had that, being sponsored to go, part of my contract was to come back and serve 6 years, which I did. And then the opportunity came where the same uncle and auntie whose children went to Balmain, and their children were older, and they were in a position to be able to, I suppose, over the years, I'd spoken to my uncle particularly about Montessori and about the ideas I had and about the vision for creating a learning community. And it just so happened, around that time, that he was in a position to be able to assist that to actually materialize. So I'd moved to the coast with a young family, and we just started looking for property for the realization of a Montessori learning community on the coast. There is still no other Montessori learning community on the coast. It was the first at the time and the only one. And so we just started putting up notices because it was pre-social media. So started putting up notices in shop windows and local venues. And we just started to collect a group of people who are interested in the idea of what this could be. Bought a property that was on 2.5 acres that had a house on it from a fellow that was in his 90s. Made a few adjustments to it. I mean, the process of finding the property took about a year and a half, and then to go through council and make the changes was probably another year and a half. And then, we opened, and we started with 15 children in a 3 to 6 environment in a casa. And then, so that's been operational now for going on 16 years, 15, 16 years. I mean, at every turn, families wanted to know or to have available to them a primary school, primary Montessori experience. So it took us probably 2 or 3 times to kind of get that off the ground, because it's not, Montessori primary schools don't open up very readily these days. It's not a small thing, but we got the community together. We had an evening where we raised, I think it was $30,000-$40,000, and we just bit the bullet and did it. Again, with about 15, 17 children. And Then we grew into the 0 to 3, so started the 0 to 3 program, and now we're looking at adolescents, hopefully in the next couple of years, having just completed the adolescent training with Laurie over in Perth. So the big thing for us is we will always be a relative in terms of size. The idea is we'll always be a relatively small community. That magic number of whatever people say it is, 80 to 120, where people are not abstractions, that you can kind of actually know everyone. And if it ever gets to a point where we need to grow, then we will just create, another one 20, 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers away and just have little pods. But we're not near that at the moment. I mean, for me, just sitting here with a pedagogy and trying to understand how to allow it to do what it can do whilst, again, playing within a game that still feels foreign, I think is for me the biggest challenge at the moment.
What have you most loved about being a Montessori educator? You've talked about a bit about the outlook that it gave you, the vista on your
Yeah.
life. Are there other things too that have?
Yeah. I'd have to say, first and foremost, that is probably the way it's framed life has been the biggest part. But I suppose to draw a parallel, a number of years ago, I was in Melbourne and went into a Dimick's bookstore, and someone was carrying a tote bag, and on the side of the bag, it said something along the lines of, he or she who reads lives 1,000 lives. He or she who doesn't only lives one. So in other words, you see life through authors and characters and things. Well, having seen, hundreds and hundreds of children and parents, I suppose I've been able to look at learning and education and growth and transformation through many, many people's eyes, and it being very, very, and the relationships being very close and intimate and deep, and diverse. I mean, it's been a gift to be able to experience all these lives. It hasn't come without its challenges. I mean, I think we think that having a community, or this modern buzzword of community, is we all sit around a fire all the time and sing Kumbaya, and it's really beautiful. And there are definitely moments of that. But when you've got that library and it's diverse and people are experiencing their own, challenges and beautiful things day in and day out, it's work.
Yeah.
It's work being in a community. And I think sometimes it's challenging in both a difficult but also a beautiful way. But I've got to say, for me, those two things, the framework that's provided and the opportunity to not only experience many, many lives, but to see how they've unfolded over time as well. And to be able to be, when we talk about play, work and play, for me, they're not different things. You go to work every day in a Montessori environment, and it's like a mixed age environment where we just play with each other every day. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's not so fun, but that's part and parcel of putting yourself out there in community, isn't it? So that for me is they're the most potent things, I'd say.
So would you say that the negotiating those relationships, maybe the conflicts that come up, that's been the most challenging aspect of your life as a Montessori educator?
I think being cognizant of my need to transform through that and how that's received. And it's like a big family, when you've got your immediate family and you live with them, you disappoint, you anger, you frustrate, you rub each other up the wrong way. Well, a learning community is just a big family. And so, I think the biggest part of it, as I said, is how not to stay the same and still have the courage to transform and know that that's going to bring, different responses from different people. And there's an interesting book that I'm sure some of you have come across. It's called The Courage to be Disliked. It's being, look, when I had my first Montessori class, it was at Balmain, and it was a 6 to 9 environment, and it just so happened to be where one of the entrances to school was, and people would walk past it every morning and every afternoon. And my biggest challenge back then, when I first was fresh out of training, was I thought I had to have the perfect Montessori environment. You had to be the perfect Montessorian, which of course doesn't exist. But I realized very quickly that it didn't exist, and that it was this work in progress, day in and day out. And so, I think coming to terms with being this person that's trained in Montessori and has done it for so many years, and that I'm not perfect in it. I'm learning every single day, but people still have this idea of who you should be and what you should be and how you should do it. And I suppose for me that brings its in, there are interesting things that come with that. Um, but I suppose at the moment my learning is really how can I just be me wherever I am in my process of transformation, and accept that my intention is not to harm or to upset or to, but I've got to be, I don't know, I've got to be true to myself and wherever I am in my process, if I expect everyone else to do the same. So, you know,
You answered that question so beautifully from the perspective of a Montessorian. In other words, saying it's, what happens out there, it's always about me, and it's always about looking in to see how I respond and how it affects me. This is sort of brings to the center the idea of the transformation of the adult, which I think a lot of Montessorians maybe in the back of their minds assume that that happens during training and then it's done and then you're transformed and you're an enlightened being for the rest of your teaching career. But I think, what you say is that it's our responsibility as adults to aid and support this holistic process of self-creation in children. And if we're going to do that, then we have to continue to be able to support that transformation of transformative process of self-creation in our own lives as adults.
yeah.
How do we do that? How, I mean, it's so hard to mandate the transformation of adults. You can't see the need for your own transformation, and having somebody else say to you, you need to transform, not transformed, is very hard to hear. So how do we do that?
I think we stop being a school, thinking that we're the teacher that has to impart all the knowledge. That for me is, and this is where we come down to the nuance of everything we do. It's interesting. I was mentioning to you off camera before how, having done the 3 to 6 training, in what, 98, 99, then going back and doing then the year after the 6 to 12 training, then, almost 20 years later, going and doing the adolescent training and revisiting the pedagogy after having spent almost 2 decades working in Montessori, I looked at it complete, or it was the add value was so significant. And that for me, it was interesting because I start to realize as Montessorians who fundamentally are proponents of, imagination and extending and pushing the bar and exploring and creating, how many of us have been through our conditioning so conditioned and so colonized that we are afraid to question what we do. I mean, for me, I'm happy to put out there, yes, we have 4 planes of development, but at the moment, in this current time, we need to have a 5th one, because if we don't have the 5th one, when the 4th and 1st plane have significant work for us to do, if we are going to be custodians, if we are going to look at cosmic succession when it comes from the adult providing an environment for a young child to grow into, in terms of, especially in that 0 to 6, where they've got this absorbent mind, we need to go through a process of consciously looking at our childhood, consciously looking at who we are, the kind of parent we want to be, the kind of learner we are, the kind of human being we are in the world. And so, I think, and why I'm saying this is not because I want to go out there and say, I'm just going to buck the system. It's not about bucking the system. It's about us having the courage to just pull things apart and look at them. And if we put them back together and it was exactly the way that we were shown it, great. But, I use it very simplistic, almost too simplistic, and it sounds silly sometimes. If life is an alphabet and I only ever live at B, how do I know B is where I want to be? Maybe, D or F or G or Z is where I want to live. So when I look at, for example, the 3-period lesson, why not, as a person who works in Montessori, why not do what we've done and say, okay, yeah, I love it. You provide a concept or you provide a presentation, you work with it, and then you elicit the information. Why not look at, well, before you even present something, you need to have a relationship. The door needs to be open. You need to invite someone to come to the table And you need to observe whether they're actually even ready for that before you, because if I just stand up I'm no different to anything else. If I stand up and just start a presentation with no observation and no awareness of readiness, then, what am I doing any differently? I'm just getting things out of my album and just throwing them at people. If I'm not providing, then, we go through that. It's almost like bookending the 3-period lesson. If then at the end, I'm not actively encouraging or providing the opportunity for exploration or extension or imagination, then I'm just providing knowledge for knowledge's sake. What I need to do is say, well, you take this knowledge, take this toolbox that you've got, and see if it works anywhere else. See if you can create new wisdom or new knowledge from what has happened here, so that the cycle continues over and over again. So for me, the biggest thing in our training, our experience of training is, yes, there's this beautiful body of philosophical information, and it is gold. I'm not ever denying that. And there are processes to present beautiful materials, and that I love too. But if it's like anything, as I said earlier, you build a house and it's a 2-story house and you want to paint the house. So you put scaffolding up and you use the scaffolding to paint the house, but then you don't live in the scaffold. You don't leave the scaffold up for the next 10 years. The scaffold comes down so you can enjoy the house. And so for me, if you're presenting the grammar boxes, if you're presenting the bead framing, whatever it is, are you going in and saying, well, this is how it is, it's been dictated to me and I'm not going to think any differently? Or are you going to, trust your observation, trust your sense, trust your experience, trust in the fact that you're a living, breathing human being who has ideas, and that's not, to be honest, I take that as paying the greatest homage to Montessori, as opposed to the opposite.
I love that analogy with real estate, where it's location, 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 but in education, it's really connection, 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 and relationships. And I hear that's what you're really referring to, that it's all about observing and making a relationship with the learner.
Mm.
Yeah.
We talk about the Trinity, Mark, in Montessori, about when we talk about the prepared environment, not just obviously the environment, the adult and the child, but we talk about, observe, prepare, link the child and get out of the way. Yeah, but we also have to grow in that as well. Just having armed with albums and a classroom and materials is not enough. We have to grow. We actually, whatever we're observing that way, we have to observe this way too. And I'm not perfect in that, and this is why we have a team of people. This is why we have the children there. We have the parents. We all collaborate together, and hopefully we learn as much as possible about ourselves.
Yeah. So I think it's no secret that mainstream education is a broken system, and there are a lot of people currently that there are debates emerging. A lot of people are looking for answers. Some people are advocating going backwards to direct teaching and more punitive behavioral management, and some people are looking to forwards to different methods. Do you think Montessori can offer a viable alternative?
Has the potential that exists with Montessori is phenomenal. Can it offer it if we remain prisoners of a system that, well, I say that, and it's actually, I've got to be cautious when I say that, because it's actually not the system, it's us. I was going to say this to you earlier, if I get frustrated or I feel limited, I only feel it because I'm choosing to feel that way. I think, however, I do feel like we have the capacity to come together and realize something that profoundly exists within Montessori's work. I do believe that. And I think I said to you again off camera, I think, Montessori and what it offers in its essence, and I don't mean, we all know Montessori can potentially be a very academic pathway. It does that, it offers that. That's not what this is about. When it comes to, as you said earlier, holistic human development, I think what it has to offer is phenomenal. And as I said, I think it's needed now more than ever before. It's needed now more than ever before. if we continue to just be schools and just think that we've got to meet curriculum and meet requirements and things like that, again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the lessons are not valuable and the skills that we learn through school I'm not saying that. But for me, I find more value when a parent says to me, where is my child at? My first question back is, who are they? First, who is this human being? Because I see it nowadays, and this is something that came up for us in the adolescent training, and something that we talked about, and Montessori talks about in her writings, is this idea that our technological advancement has far outstripped our soulful development. And so, for me, don't get me wrong. And again, all of you know this, there's common misconceptions around Montessori's view around technology. Every human expression, every creation is a technology. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with the idea that if you have technology that's very powerful, that can manipulate others, who is the person sitting there with their finger on the button? Who is the person sitting? That, for me, is what Montessori is about. The kind of person that we are growing, because that person who understands the interconnected nature of all things, that understands that it's not about competition, it's about collaboration, that understands that we are all part of this supreme reality that Montessori talks about. If we understand that, and this is why she said the hope and promise for the child, for humanity, is in the child. If a child, and talks about this science of peace, if a child grows up in an environment that values the contribution that every human has to make, then their outlook on the world is going to be very different. They're a human society, they're going to go forward and potentially value different things. And we are at a crossroads at the moment, because and this is the beauty of Montessori, and we talk about the whole and the parts. If I stand really way back and I'm not emotionally invested and triggered by these things, when I stand back, I realize it's an unfolding that has to happen. The process is happening. It's just, for me, happening slower than a lot of us would like for it to happen. But you can see the pendulum swinging. Gone are the days where children are seen and not heard. Now, and I've probably spoken to a few of you about this, I've seen now grown adults, grown mums and dads that are busting to go to the toilet but won't go because their 2-year-old is telling them not to go to the toilet. Like, that's how far the pendulum has actually swung. We've got to find a mechanism, or we've got to go back to the pedagogy and be able to highlight how to create. We talk in Montessori about freedom within limits. For me, it actually now goes a step further. We are charged with being able to concretize the abstraction that is this sustainability container. That's what freedom within limits is how do we, because Montessori takes a species view, how do we help children through boundaries and through role modeling, understand that you are going to construct yourself through your relationship with yourself, others, and the environment. Therefore, how do you care for those things? So if we look at it from that perspective, is it solely about academics, or is it about the balance between sustaining the very resources that we require to have the opportunity to create in life? And that's, for me, the big balance and the big play that we're having.
If Montessori has so much potential to help humankind transform and progress, why is it not more recognized? Why is it not more widespread?
It's interesting you say that, when many of you can relate to this. How many people come into an environment and look at it and say to you, why is this not everywhere? How commonly is that said? I think for a number of reasons. One, I don't believe that the story has been adequately told. I think in terms of a narrative, I think the story needs to be told, and I think it needs to be told not only unapologetically, I think it needs to be told fearlessly. I think we live at a time where, in some ways, I'd rather put all the chips on the table and say, if we're going to become a dinosaur, let's find out. But if we've got this beautiful, beautiful information, I'd rather find that out too, in terms of how the world's going to respond. But I think for me, moving forward, it is about telling the story in such a way that, because up until now, it seems to isolate us, and I don't understand why it does that. I think, again, it goes back, Mark, it goes back to language. I think we've got to look at talking about, and I think this actually came up in your conference, talking about what language you use. Is it conventional, mainstream? Is it alternative? I think we've got to really start to be honest. I think, and this came up a few years ago when a group of us came together, and there's a smaller group of us that actually said, we need to actually take a break for a moment, do a deep dive into the pedagogy, go back to the foundation, because for me, I always find the answer always lies there. If you want to really, really if you feel a little bit lost, just go back to the foundational principles. And 9 times out of 10, I find the compass or the direction to go is very clearly laid out there in terms of, when you look at a mixed age environment, when you look at the way you want to set up your classes, the world for us should be very similar. Why can't we think different things? Why can't different Montessorians have different ideas? As a matter of fact, why would we all want to be cardboard cutouts of one another? I want to know what you think. And if that challenges me, great. If it triggers me, the question for me is, well, why does it trigger me? Why do I have to be right or wrong? Why can't I just love that second period? Why can't I just love to play and have that interplay and be living and thriving in that, rather than the mechanism that teaches us that you've got to compete, be right or wrong, win or lose? I think for me, that kind of thing in Montessori, if we don't do it from the grassroots, you've seen it. If you've got an adolescent at the moment in your care or around you, forget the adolescent. The 3 and 4-year-olds are calling us on our own garbage. The adolescents are doing it in no uncertain terms with language that is a little bit, more colorful than the 3 and 4-year-olds. So I think we need to take a strong, hard look at ourselves, to be honest.
I think you're spot on there, and nobody's responded with this answer to this question that on this program that I've asked. And I think it's true that we haven't really got our story straight. And do you think that having so many different tribes who have difficulty getting on with each other in the Montessori community worldwide, do you think that inhibits us from telling others who we are? Does that get in the way?
Um, yes, because I'd love an overarching narrative that celebrates our difference and says this is exactly what we are. We are all different, and that's okay, because when you walk down the street, you don't see clones of yourself. As much as the mechanism is trying to make us that way, it's not reality. Montessori, for me, is reality, and it happens in real time. And so for us, rather than trying to work out which Montessori way is right or wrong, why don't we just celebrate it all and say this is actually true to life? And that's what Montessori is. And if we can learn, and that goes back to the Druids, and this is what I love about Montessori for me, we talk about this one thing that Montessori for me offered me is I can go to any book now, any book, and I read it, and every one of them has value, because I'm not looking at it from, is it right or wrong, good or bad? Is there truth or is there no truth? Are they trying to, pull the wool over your eyes? It's just like there are truth, to use a very, modern day teenager, there are truth bombs everywhere. It's just, are we willing to see them? And so for me, we've got to let go of our egos and let go of that hierarchy, and we've got to let go of it all and just say, actually, this is what Montessori is. This is real. And once we can script that narrative, then I think we choose to turn over a new chapter and move in a different direction.
That's a very spiritually aware answer, Dimitri, that judgment is what can get in the way of us seeing reality the way it is. So if we're able to experience the child without judgment about whether that child's right or wrong, and Montessori would say, then we can see the child for who they are. And yet, as adult Montessorians, we have trouble doing that with one another, just suspending judgment and seeing us for who we are. I think our journey, you're right, our journey as Montessori, as a community, is learning how to do that with one another.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were saying that, my mind went to a big room full of Montessorians, and I look around, I think, none of us is Maria Montessori. So we can't, none of us is doing or can claim her name more than anybody else. We are all taking this beautiful idea. And this is why I was thinking about, the picture you put up, this notion of going back to co-founding something. No one finds something on their own. We are all building something on the back of or collectively with other people. We're all sculpting something. No one of my thoughts is solely my own thought without having it be somewhat, influenced from the experiences I had or something somebody has said or what I've heard. And so at the end of the day, we walk into a room like that and we've got to realize that, there's nobody here that's more Montessori than anybody else, and so I'd like to kind of think that, we can at some point focus on this idea of, again, similar to what I said to you about the children, not how much Montessori do we know? Can I quote every quote out of every book? It's who am I at the end of the day? And I can tell you, there are moments where I look in the mirror and I think, yeah, okay, I've made, choices today that upon reflection, I would make again. And other choices that I think, if I had this time again, I'd probably do something a little bit differently, thanks to the experience that I've had. And so if we could all reflect like that, and this is where I say to you, the game is not our game. It's like Montessori spelt out the game for us to kind of take it and implement it. I want to walk into a learning community, and yes, I want to provide the opportunity to present certain concepts, but by the same token, I can't solely be sitting there observing the child and assessing the child and marking the child off a tracking document. I actually need to sit there and reflect on myself too, reflect on the other guides, reflect on parents, them reflecting on me, and slow down enough to create space for enough observation, reflection, analysis, conversation, and engagement in interaction and connection, so that we are all feeling like we're actually in this library taking from the profound collective wisdom that's there. And so, that's what the goal is. If that ends up doing me out of a business, well, I don't know. We're living in an economic world. I've got to keep the doors open too.
So how do you balance that, the relativism that you're talking about, that we're all Montessorians and the need to come together around that, with the need for standards, to maintain standards? We've all probably had the experience of walking into a classroom that wasn't done particularly well according to Montessori standards, and it doesn't work. And so, I mean, that can be taken to the extreme in the AMI community, where it's considered that if you're trained with Grazzini, or and you trace your authenticity by tracing yourself back through trainers to Maria, through degrees of uh, um, separation from Maria, right? And that's taken to an extreme where if you train with us, you're an authentic Montessori, and if you don't, well, we don't really want to know you. Don't come to our conferences or work at our schools. Versus, the need for some consistency in the Montessori community, where we don't have an overarching world gatekeeper.
The gatekeeper.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful, and I repeat this often in terms of this very question. Where we're going with this is there's a Emerson quote that I tend to kind of misquote intentionally sometimes, and it goes along the lines of, "Who you are shouts so loudly in my ear, I can't hear what you're saying." And I think for me, there is no perfect Montessorian. There are people who have dedicated deep thought and deep time to to their craft, whatever it is that they do. But I don't know. I think we're getting too hung up around labels and ideas and things like that. For me, I've witnessed in my 25 years, I've witnessed human beings connect with children and impart information because of who they are, not because of what they know. And so, what do we all say? We often say this amongst each other. We say you should be able to lift Montessori and put it in the middle of nowhere and still be able to impart a lot of the lessons. And I just think, we're very fortunate to have these beautiful materials that cost a lot of money. But at the end of the day, I find that, you know, again, to be philosophical and I suppose somewhat spiritual, and actually, I think we've had this conversation possibly in the past, had this where we've touched on this. There's a beautiful book that I think is beautiful that Carlos Castaneda wrote called The Teachings of Don Juan, and he goes into the Mexican. He meets a Mexican shaman and goes into deep conversation exploration with him. And all that aside, it doesn't matter. Part of what I take away from that is this Mexican shaman that, the old adage of your perspective shapes your reality. Well, they take it a step further to say that, well, no, it's your interpretation of your perspective that shapes your reality. And I think for me, if we can walk away feeling like we are still free to imagine, to explore, to discover, to question, to connect, then I don't know. I think Montessori has the greatest fear for Montessori to do itself in is Montessori. And so, I don't know. We've got Mark, we've got this beautiful thing. Honest to goodness, it's beautiful. Is it the be all and end all of everything? I don't know. For me, it'd be naive to say that. I think there's a lot of beautiful things out there. The beauty of Montessori is, I think, it would be remiss of us to not be willing to imagine what's possible.
Yeah.
Now, that for me is ultimately where I come back to, and this is where we're changing our bannerhead from Central Coast Montessori to Imagine, because for me, if you don't imagine, then what are you doing? So anyway.
Beautiful. I love it. Does anybody have a question or a comment for Dimitri before we close?
Or challenge something. It's fun to play with ideas. Oh, there's one, Liz. No, your hand is up. Oh, you give me a high five.
I love that you ended with this idea of imagination. And I know that Montessori saw that as the most valuable resource in the universe, because every creation around us, every solution to a problem starts as an idea in some human being's mind. And so that resource of imagination, being able to imagine solutions for problems, is what we need more of. And yet we don't encourage that in most education, most schools.
I often say to people, life is not a problem to be solved, but just a mystery to be lived, and that's the thing. You go in this is the beauty of the environment. You go in every day and there's just, there's infinite possibility. So
on that note, thank you so much for your time this evening, Dimitri. I really enjoyed talking with you. I could just continue talking with you for hours, and I'm sure we will off camera later, but it's great to connect with you again.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to Montessori Australia for the opportunity to have a chat.
All right. Good night, everybody.